Somewhere along the western bank of the Nile, the sky begins to change. The fierce white light of the afternoon softens into something amber and low, stretching long shadows across mud-brick walls and palm-fringed riverbanks. The air, which has pressed down on the land like a warm hand all day, begins to loosen its grip. A faint breeze stirs. The river catches the last of the light and holds it for a moment, glittering quietly before the colour fades and the water returns to its deep, unhurried dark. This is nightfall in ancient Egypt, and it is not an ending. It is a shift. For thousands of years, long before the electric glow of modern cities erased the boundary between day and night, the people of ancient Egypt lived inside a rhythm that was older than any pharaoh, older than any pyramid. The rhythm of light and dark, the rhythm of heat and cool, the rhythm of a civilization built beside a river that breathed with the seasons and set the pace of ordinary life in ways that no king's decree ever could. When the sun dipped below the western horizon, something changed in Egypt. Not suddenly, and not with any drama. It changed the way all things change when they have been changing forever. Slowly, quietly, and completely. Imagine you are standing in a small village in the Nile Delta, sometime around 3,000 years ago. The last hour of light is dissolving over the flat fields. Farmers are returning from the irrigation channels, their feet still damp, their tools carried loosely over tired shoulders. Children who have been playing near the water's edge are being called inside. The smell of wood smoke begins to drift from open doorways. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shifts and settles. A dog moves through the dust without urgency. The world is not going dark in any frightening way. It is simply going quiet. This is the Egypt that this journey is about. Not the Egypt of temple ceilings and gilded thrones, though those things existed and they matter, but the Egypt of ordinary people, the farmers and bakers, the soldiers and servants, the mothers and merchants and children who lived most of their lives not in monuments, but in small rooms, on rooftops, along familiar paths worn smooth by 10,000 passing feet. The Egypt that existed after the sun went down and the world became something softer and slower and more human. The Nile shaped everything, not just agriculture, not just trade, but time itself. The river's flooding determined when people worked and when they rested. The climate, hot and dry and mercifully cool in the evenings, pulled people outdoors when the day's heat broke. And the near-total absence of artificial light, nothing like what we know today, only oil lamps and candles and small fires, meant that darkness was real darkness, not inconvenient, not merely dim, but a genuine presence that reorganized how people moved, where they gathered, what they did, and how long they stayed awake. That darkness was experienced differently depending on where you lived and who you were. In the grand estates of Thebes or Memphis, wealthy households could afford enough oil to light several rooms. Servants moved through lamplit corridors. A noble might recline on a wooden bed with a linen sheet, close to an open courtyard where the night air circulated. The darkness was kept at arm's length. It was a manageable thing. But in the villages that lined the Nile for hundreds of miles in every direction, the evening economy of light was far more modest. A single clay lamp, perhaps, the glow of a cooking fire, enough to see by, barely, and only for a little while. When that light was gone, most people found their way to sleep, not because they had finished everything they wanted to do, but because there was simply nothing left to see by. And then there were those who lived and worked beyond the reach of any lamp at all. Herdsmen on the desert margins, fishermen still out on the river as darkness fell, reading the current by feel and memory, soldiers on patrol, workers camping near distant quarry sites. For these people, night was not softened by any comfort. It was simply the sky above, the stars in their appointed places, and the long hours until morning. What strikes you when you begin to look closely at ancient Egyptian evenings is how varied and full they actually were. Night was not a blank space between days. It was its own kind of world, with its own sounds and fears and pleasures and necessities. People ate their evening meals, families gathered, neighbours talked. Work that could not stop simply continued by whatever light was available. The temples shifted into their nighttime rhythms, and above everything, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, not decoration, but meaning, watched carefully by a civilization that had mapped the sky for centuries. So settle in now, let the day go. The heat is fading, the light is fading, and somewhere along the Nile the evening air is beginning to move. We're going back a very long way, to a time when night was darker and slower and somehow richer than anything we know, and we're going to spend it there together, in the quiet hours of the ancient world. As the sun began its final descent toward the western horizon, life in an Egyptian village did not simply pause, it reorganized. The last hour of daylight was some of the busiest of the entire day, a compressed rush of finishing and securing and preparing that happened with the quiet urgency of people who knew exactly how little time they had left. Farmers who had been working the field since early morning, sometimes since before sunrise, when the air was still cool enough to move quickly, now gathered their tools and made their way back along the irrigation channels. Hoes and sickles were carried home and stored carefully, not out of tidiness, but out of necessity. A broken or missing tool could mean a lost day of work, and no farming household could afford that lightly. Animals were brought in from grazing, goats, cattle, the indispensable donkeys that carried water and grain and everything else a working family needed. They were penned and settled before full dark, because darkness brought its own dangers to livestock, and the sounds of an unsettled animal in the night could disturb an entire household. Along the river itself, the rhythm was slightly different. Fishermen who had launched their papyrus skiffs in the cooler morning hours were now reading the light, judging how much longer they could remain on the water before the fading visibility made navigation difficult. Nets were pulled in and checked. The day's catch, if it was good, was carried to shore and either prepared immediately or salted and dried for storage. Boatmen moving cargo along the Nile's busy trade routes began looking for safe places to moor for the night, since travelling the river after dark carried real risk. Submerged obstacles, shifting sandbars, the unpredictability of currents that changed with the flood season. Inside the home, women who had been working through the hottest part of the day, grinding grain, weaving, tending small children, now shifted to the tasks that benefited from the evening's cooler air. Bread might be prepared in the late afternoon so it could be baked while there was still light enough to tend the fire safely. Water jars that had been filled in the morning were checked. The evening meal, modest and uncomplicated for most families, began to take shape. Bathing, or at least washing, happened in these transitional hours whenever possible. The Egyptians valued cleanliness highly, and while the wealthy had access to dedicated washing rooms within their homes, ordinary families made do with water drawn from the river or from a shared courtyard well. The cooling air made this a more pleasant task than anything attempted at midday, when the sun had turned every surface into something too hot to touch comfortably. Children were washed. Adults rinsed away the day's dust and sweat. There was a particular relief in that ritual that you can almost feel across the distance of 3,000 years. The sensation of cool water on sun-warmed skin, the brief pause before the evening's final tasks began. Not everyone could afford to stop. Bakers employed in the great estates or temple complexes worked hours that extended well into the evening, since bread production for large households required sustained effort and early preparation for the following morning. Potters and craftsmen in urban workshops might work by lamplight when deadlines demanded it, Though this was costly enough to discourage unless necessary, scribes with administrative work to complete sometimes wrote by the light of small oil lamps, their reed pens moving carefully across papyrus in the gathering dark. And then, gradually, the character of the world began to change. The sounds shifted. The calls and movements of the working day, the shouts across fields, the lowing of cattle being driven, the splash of oars on the river, gave way to something quieter and more contained. People withdrew from public paths and open spaces and moved toward the smaller, more intimate world of their own households. The cooking fire became the centre of things. The courtyard, if you had one, became a gathering place rather than a workspace. The village street, so busy and purposeful just an hour before, began to empty. This was not a dramatic transformation. It happened in degrees, almost imperceptibly, the way all natural transitions happen when they have been rehearsed every evening for thousands of years. But by the time the last colour had drained from the western sky, the world had quietly rearranged itself, and a different kind of life was beginning. When that last colour finally left the sky, the darkness that replaced it was something most of us today have never truly experienced. There were no streetlights casting their familiar orange glow across rooftops. There were no lit windows glowing softly from neighbouring houses, no distant hum of a city that never quite goes dark. When night came to an ancient Egyptian village, it came completely, and the only light available was light that someone had made and paid for and carefully tended. That light most often came from a simple oil lamp. The design was practical and unpretentious, a shallow clay bowl, sometimes no larger than the palm of your hand, filled with oil and fitted with a wick made from twisted plant fibres. Linen was commonly used for wicking material, though rush pith, papyrus scraps and other fibrous plant matter served the same purpose. The wick was drawn up through the oil and lit, and it burned with a small, soft flame, steady enough in still air, but vulnerable to any breath of wind that found its way through an open doorway or the gaps in a mud-brick wall. The oil itself was the real expense. Castor oil was one of the most widely used fuels in ancient Egypt, pressed from the seeds of the castor plant that grew in abundance along the Nile. It was affordable by the standards of the day, but it was never free, and a household that kept a lamp burning through the entire night was consuming something with real value. Sesame oil, linseed oil, and various animal fats were also used depending on availability and what a family could obtain. Wealthier households might use higher quality, cleaner burning oils that produced less smoke. Ordinary families used what they had, which often meant accepting a lamp that sputtered and smelled and left a faint oily residue in the air. And the smell was part of the experience. Step inside a lamplit room in ancient Egypt, and you would notice it immediately. A low, warm, slightly acrid quality to the air, the byproduct of combustion and imperfect fuel. Castor oil, in particular, was known for producing a heavy, distinctive smoke when burned, and in a small enclosed room with limited ventilation, that smoke had nowhere particular to go. It drifted upward and settled against the ceiling and walls. Over time, the interior surfaces of homes that relied on regular lamp use would have accumulated a faint but persistent darkening, a quiet record of all the evenings spent gathered around that small flickering light. Because the light itself was small, that is perhaps the thing most worth holding in your mind. A single clay lamp did not illuminate a room the way we might imagine. It created a pool of warm, unsteady light, perhaps an arm's length across, and beyond that pool shadows gathered quickly. The corners of a room were dark. The space near the ceiling was dark. Movement through a room after the lamp was lit meant moving carefully, with an awareness of where the furniture was and where the threshold of each doorway sat, because beyond the immediate circle of the flame, the darkness was genuine. This shaped everything about how people moved and worked and talked after sunset. tasks that required fine detail, close weaving, writing, the preparation of small objects, were either completed before dark or conducted by bringing the work very close to the lamp, leaning over it, letting the light fall directly onto your hands. Eye strain was likely a common companion to evening work. Reading, for those who could read, was a deliberate act that required positioning yourself carefully relative to the flame. Even conversation had a particular quality in that kind of light. People naturally drew closer together, not just for warmth, but because the lamp created a small enclosed world, and sitting within it felt different from sitting just outside it. The shadows themselves were animated. A lamp flame is never perfectly still. It responds to breathing, to shifting air, to the slight tremor of someone moving nearby. And so the shadows it cast moved constantly, stretching and shortening along the walls, giving a kind of restless life to everything in the room. You might find this unsettling, or you might find it oddly companionable, depending on your disposition and how accustomed you were to it. For most ancient Egyptians, it was simply the texture of evening, as familiar and unremarkable as the feel of cool air after sunset. Not everyone had equal access to this modest comfort. The differences between households were real and meaningful. In a wealthy home, the kind of multi-room mudbrick villa that a prosperous official or estate owner might inhabit, there might be several lamps burning at once, each placed in a different room or on a different surface. Some lamps of higher quality featured stands or holders that elevated the flame and allowed the light to spread more evenly. Better oil meant cleaner burning and less smoke. There was even the occasional use of torches and larger braziers for outdoor evening gatherings among the elite, something that would have seemed extravagant to an ordinary farming family. For the privileged, evening could be reasonably well lit, and the inconveniences of darkness were largely a matter of comfort rather than necessity. For ordinary households, the calculation was more careful. You did not burn oil you did not need. If the family had gathered for the evening meal and conversation, perhaps one lamp was sufficient, set in the centre of the space, casting enough light to eat by, enough to see the faces around you. If someone needed to move to another part of the house after dark, they either carried the lamp with them or they moved in the dark, navigating by familiarity and touch. Going outside at night, to the courtyard, to the storage area, often meant going without any lamp at all, letting your eyes adjust to whatever moonlight was available, which on cloudy nights or during new moon periods meant very little indeed. Temples occupied a different category entirely. The great religious complexes that anchored Egyptian life were not subject to the same constraints as a private home. They had resources, grain, oil, labour, on a scale that no ordinary family could approach, and the rituals of temple life continued after dark in ways that required sustained, deliberate illumination. Temple precincts used larger lamps, multiple lamps, oil reserves that were carefully maintained as part of the institution's administrative records. Some ritual observances specifically required light, and so light was provided regardless of the hour or the cost. Walking past a temple complex at night, you might have seen a soft glow emanating from within its walls, something quiet and controlled, nothing like the blazing torchlight of popular imagination, but a visible, steady presence that set it apart from the darkened homes around it. For the sleepy village at large, though, the night settled into a particular kind of intimacy that only real darkness produces. The circle of lamplight was a boundary, and everything within it, the familiar faces, the warm smell of the oil, the shifting shadows on mud-brick walls, felt close and contained and known. Beyond it lay the full Egyptian night, enormous and quiet and very, very dark. There was something in that arrangement that drew people together simply by the nature of the light, You did not wander, you did not bustle, you settled, and you stayed where the warmth and the glow were, and you let the rest of the world go dark around you. So you have settled near the lamp, drawn inward by the circle of its glow, and now it is worth pausing to consider exactly where you are. The structure itself, the walls around you, the floor beneath you, and what this space looked and felt and smelled like once the last light of day had left the sky. For the vast majority of ancient Egyptians, home was a mud-brick house. The material was simple and practical, made from the rich Nile silt that was so abundantly available along the river's banks, mixed with water and chopped straw for binding, then pressed into wooden moulds and left to dry in the relentless Egyptian sun. Once cured, these bricks were surprisingly sturdy. They held their shape through years of use, and they had one quality that made them particularly suited to the climate. They were slow to change temperature. During the day, thick mud brick walls absorbed the heat gradually, keeping the interior cooler than the air outside. In the evening, that stored warmth released slowly back into the rooms, so that the space after dark was never cold, but carried a kind of deep, earthy warmth that radiated gently from every surface. Run your hand along the interior wall of an ordinary Egyptian home at night, and you would feel that warmth still lingering in the brick. The texture was not smooth, it was rough in places, plastered in others with a thin coat of mud or lime that had been applied in broad strokes and left to dry. In wealthier homes, these plaster surfaces were sometimes painted, decorated with simple geometric borders or ochre-toned bands of colour. In more modest homes, the walls were plain, their surface interrupted only by the occasional shelf or niche cut directly into the brick where a small object might rest, a little figurine, a pottery vessel, perhaps the lamp itself. The floor was hard-packed earth in most ordinary homes, swept and smoothed through years of use until it was almost stone-like in its firmness. In some homes, a mat of woven rush or palm fibre might cover part of the floor, providing a slightly softer and warmer surface to sit or sleep on. These mats had a dry, faintly grassy smell to them, something clean and quiet, and they rustled softly when anyone shifted their weight. The rooms themselves were small by almost any modern standard. An ordinary worker's house might contain 2 or 3 rooms in sequence, one leading into the next, each one modest in its dimensions. There was no long corridor, no sense of space to move through. The arrangement was more like a series of close-contained chambers, each one serving multiple purposes depending on the time of day and the needs of the household. What was a working and cooking space during daylight hours became, as the evening deepened, a place to eat, to talk, and eventually to sleep. Ventilation was a constant consideration. Egypt's heat was relentless, and the people who lived in it understood air movement in practical, detailed ways. Windows in ordinary homes were small, sometimes little more than narrow openings near the top of a wall, placed deliberately high to let hot air escape while keeping out the worst of the midday sun. These openings might be fitted with simple wooden grills or covered loosely with cloth. In the evening, when the air outside cooled faster than the air within, the difference in temperature created a gentle draught that moved through these high apertures, carrying the day's accumulated heat outward with it. It was not always enough, particularly in the deep heat of summer, but it was something. And this is where the rooftop and the courtyard became essential. Many Egyptian homes extended upward in function as well as structure. The flat mud brick roof was not merely a structural element, it was living space, used regularly and deliberately. In the warmest months, and particularly during the hottest nights of summer, family members would carry their sleeping mats upstairs and spend the night under the open sky. Up there, the air moved more freely. The stars were unobstructed, Whatever breeze came off the desert or drifted up from the direction of the river could reach you, and the ground heat that made the enclosed rooms stifling was left behind below. Sleeping on the roof was not a hardship. For much of the year it was simply the sensible choice, and many Egyptians would have thought nothing of it. The courtyard served a similar function. Larger homes, those belonging to officials, estate owners, or prosperous merchants, were often built around an open central courtyard, a private outdoor space that the rooms of the house faced inward toward. In the evening, this courtyard became a gathering place. The air there was fresher than inside any enclosed room, and the open sky above meant that the accumulated heat of the day dissipated more quickly. In wealthier households, a courtyard might contain a small pool, potted plants, or a tree whose roots had slowly worked their way into the compacted earth over many years, a place of genuine quiet beauty in the evening hours, shadowed and still, with the sound of water if the family was prosperous enough to maintain it. The contrast between elite and ordinary residences became particularly apparent after dark. A wealthy official's home was a different world. Larger rooms, higher ceilings, multiple courtyards, and a spatial generosity that allowed for something approaching privacy. Servants had their own areas. Family members had dedicated sleeping rooms rather than shared spaces. Storage was separate from living. The physical experience of moving through such a house at night, even by lamplight, would have felt spacious and deliberate, each room having a distinct purpose and a certain formality about it. In a modest worker's home, the night was more communal and more compressed. A family of 5 or 6 people shared the same small rooms, and the boundaries between sleeping, eating, and living were blurred by necessity. Children might sleep together on a mat near one wall, adults on another. The smell of the evening meal, whatever had been prepared over the small raised hearth, still hung in the air, mixing with the lamp smoke and the dry earthen smell of the brick. Someone's breathing was always audible. A child turned in their sleep. The family's few animals, if they were kept in a ground-floor room as they often were in rural households, occasionally moved or called out softly in the dark. It was close and warm and particular. There was a texture to the Egyptian domestic night that would have been entirely familiar to the people who lived it, and almost entirely strange to us. The sense of enclosure was not merely architectural, it was sensory, a gathering in of everything and everyone into the smallest illuminated space. The rough coolness of brick against a shoulder, the slight give of a woven mat underfoot, the low smell of oil burning steadily in its clay bowl, and beyond the open high window, if you lay still and listened, the sounds that the Egyptian night offered freely. A dog somewhere in the village, the wind moving through palm leaves, the very faint and distant sound of the river, eternal and unhurried. Privacy, as we understand it, was a luxury that most families simply did not have. But there was another quality that those close quarters provided, a sense of presence, of nearness, of knowing exactly where everyone you loved was sleeping. In a world where the dark was genuinely dark and the night carried its own uncertainties, that knowledge was not nothing. It was, in its quiet way, a form of comfort that needed no lamp at all. And within that small warm space, as the lamp burned low and the last heat of the day settled into the walls around you, the evening meal was being prepared or had already been eaten, simple food, unhurried, shaped by whatever the day's labour had made possible and whatever the household stores contained. For most ancient Egyptians, the evening meal was not elaborate. It did not need to be. After a long day of physical work, whether in the fields, along the river bank, at a building site or inside a workshop, the appetite was honest and direct, and the food that answered it was equally straightforward. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal, eaten by almost everyone regardless of their station. baked in round, flat loaves or conical shapes, depending on the region and the household, made from emmer wheat or barley flour, that had been ground by hand against a flat stone. The grinding itself was arduous, repetitive work, often done by women in the household, and the flour it produced was coarse enough that bread made from it was genuinely hard on the teeth over a lifetime. Evidence preserved in ancient skulls tells us that dentalware was common, a quiet record of 10,000 loaves eaten over a working life. That bread, still carrying some warmth from the day's baking, was the thing you reached for first. It was dense and filling in the way that food prepared by tired hands for tired bodies tends to be. There was no pretension to it. It did what it needed to do. Alongside the bread came beer. And here it is worth pausing, because beer in ancient Egypt was not what we might think of when we hear the word. It was not a luxury. It was not a social indulgence. It was a daily staple as fundamental as the bread it was often made alongside, sharing much of the same grain base, a thick, slightly fermented liquid that was more nourishing than intoxicating, closer in practice to liquid bread than to any modern beverage. Workers received it as part of their official rations. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. It was stored in tall ceramic jars sealed with clay stoppers and straw, stacked along the walls of storerooms or kept in the coolest part of the house. And a household that ran low on its supply of beer was a household facing a genuine shortage of calories. The brewing process was domestic and regular, woven into the rhythm of the household week much the way baking was. Grain was partially germinated, baked into loaves, then crumbled into water and left to ferment for a short period. The result was strained through a basket or cloth and collected into a jar. The flavour would have been sour, yeasty, slightly sweet, rich with sediment. You drank it through a reed straw to filter out the thicker solids, and the act of sitting in the evening with a jar of beer and a piece of bread was the closest thing most Egyptian households had to what we might call winding down. The rest of the evening meal arranged itself around bread and beer in ways that varied by season and circumstance. Onions were among the most common additions, cheap, abundant, pungent, and deeply satisfying in the way that alliums always are when you've been working in the heat all day, and your body is asking for something sharp and real. Garlic, too. Leeks. These were everyday flavours, and their smell would have clung to the hands and breath of ordinary Egyptians in a way that was entirely unremarkable, simply the smell of a working household at night time. Fish was common in the diet of those who lived near the Nile, which was most of Egypt. It could be eaten fresh when available, but more often it was dried or salted and kept for days or weeks, a preserved protein that could be added to a meal without the need for immediate preparation. The smell of dried fish hanging in a warm room is distinctive, dense, marine, slightly sharp, and it would have been one of the characteristic scents of an Egyptian home in the evening, blended with the smoke from the cooking fire and the earthy warmth of the bread. Legumes rounded out the meal, lentils, fava beans, chickpeas. These were eaten regularly and prepared in ways that were simple and practical. Lentils boiled until soft, perhaps with oil and salt. Beans mashed or left whole, something solid and sustaining to accompany the bread. The combination of grain and legume, so foundational to human diets across many ancient cultures, provided in its quiet way a nutritional balance that kept working bodies functional through long days and longer seasons. People did not think of it in those terms. They simply ate what was available and what tasted good. But the diet that emerged from Egyptian agricultural life had a practical soundness to it. Vegetables from household gardens or the market could add variety. Cucumbers, which Egyptians were particularly fond of, and various leafy greens that wilted easily in the heat, but were eaten fresh when possible. Figs, dates, and other fruits appeared seasonally, sweet things that required no preparation, and were eaten by hand in the natural way of people eating something they enjoy at the end of a long day. Cooking in an ordinary home happened on a small raised clay hearth, modest in construction, fueled by dried animal dung or wood when it was available, charcoal in some households. The fire was managed carefully, fuel was not endless, and waste was unaffordable, and the cooking that took place over it was simple by necessity. A pot of lentils simmering, flatbread laid directly onto the hot surface of the hearth or against its clay walls, the smell of onion meeting hot oil in a clay vessel. These were the sounds and smells of the Egyptian kitchen at the end of the day, and they were the same in village after village, household after household, generation after generation. In wealthier homes, the evening meal looked genuinely different. Officials and estate owners ate with more variety and abundance. Roasted waterfowl, cuts of beef or mutton, honey-sweetened cakes, imported oils, wine from vineyards in the delta or from abroad. The tables in such homes were served by household staff, and the food arrived in greater quantity and with greater ceremony. Wine, rather than beer, marked the elevated table. It was expensive, associated with refinement, and appeared in tomb paintings with a frequency that reflects its status as something worth commemorating. Wealthy Egyptians enjoyed their food, and the evidence they left behind suggests genuine pleasure in abundance. But for the great majority, the meal was what it always was: bread, beer, onions, a bit of dried fish, lentils if the pot had been kept going, perhaps a date or two, eaten slowly, as something sweet to close the day. And there is something quietly profound about that repetition. The same foods, prepared the same way, eaten at the same hour in the same small room, with the same people gathered close by. Routine is not nothing. In a life shaped by hard physical labour and real material uncertainty, the reliable return of the evening meal, the familiar smells rising in the room, the weight of bread in the hand, the first long drink from the beer jar, was its own form of order. It said that the day had ended. It said that you were home. The body, which had been given so much to do since sunrise, could finally begin to let go. The lamp cast its small circle of light across the meal. Outside, the Egyptian night continued to deepen. Inside, for a little while, there was this warmth and food and the quiet company of familiar faces. When the meal was finished, and the last of the bread had been eaten and the beer jar set aside, the evening did not simply end. There was still time, not much, and not inexhaustible, but enough for the other things that a human life requires, the things that are not labour, the things that exist in the space between the end of work and the beginning of sleep. For families living in the close quarters of a village house, this was often the warmest part of the day. Not in temperature, the walls had been releasing their heat for hours by now, and in the cooler months the night air carried a real chill, but in the way that warmth actually means something when you speak of people gathered together. Children who had been put to smaller tasks during the day, carrying water or minding younger siblings or helping with the animals, were now simply children again. They sat near their parents. They asked questions. They reached for the last of the dates and were perhaps allowed to have them. The care of young children was woven into the evening in a way that was entirely ordinary and constant. Infants were held, nursed, and settled. Small children were coaxed towards sleep, talked to in the soft voices that parents have used since the beginning of time. Egyptian mothers are depicted in art nursing their children with a tenderness that crosses every boundary of era and culture, and the physical closeness of that act, the warmth of it, the patience it required at the end of an already long day, was simply part of what evening meant in a household with young ones. Storytelling was one of the evening's gifts. Egypt had a rich tradition of narrative, tales of gods and heroes, stories of clever officials outmanoeuvring their rivals, adventures in strange and distant lands, cautionary accounts of pride meeting its proper end. Many of these stories existed in written form, recorded on papyrus by scribes who valued them, but for most ordinary Egyptians they were oral things, passed from person to person by voice and memory. An elder repeating something they had heard as a child, a parent explaining the old stories in the way their own parent had explained them, the tale changing slightly in the telling, as all living stories do, and becoming something particular to the household that told it. In this way, the great myths and fables of Egyptian culture moved through time, not in libraries, but in the mouths of people sitting together in the evening. You might imagine sitting near the door of a house in a village along the Nile, the last faint colour gone from the western sky, the night insects beginning their own chorus in the reeds. Inside, someone is humming. It is not a performance. It is the kind of humming that happens when a person is tired and content in equal measure, when the body has done its work and the mind is drifting but not yet ready to go. Music in ordinary Egyptian life was modest and real in exactly this way. Small hand drums kept a simple rhythm, a wooden flute, its tones soft and breathy. The harp, which Egyptians loved deeply, was present in wealthier homes and at formal gatherings, but even the simplest instrument, even the act of clapping in time or singing a work song quietly to yourself at the end of the day, was its own form of music. It did not require an audience. It was simply what people did when they had a moment and felt like it. Games existed too, though they belonged more to the lighter hours than the deepest part of the night. Senet was perhaps the most beloved, a board game played on a grid of 30 squares, moving pieces in a pattern that carried symbolic meaning connected to the journey of the soul, though in practical terms it was also simply a game, played competitively, played for pleasure, played by people who wanted something to do with their hands while they talked. Children had toys, small carved animals with movable jaws, dolls made of cloth and wood, painted balls. The presence of these objects in the archaeological record is a quiet reminder that childhood and its pleasures were understood and valued. Even in a world defined by labour and scarcity, people made things for children to play with. Social life in villages extended beyond the walls of a single household. Houses were built close together, sometimes sharing walls, and the boundaries between one family's evening and another's were permeable in the way they tend to be wherever people live in genuine proximity. A neighbour might lean in from the doorway. A woman visiting a friend, spinning or weaving in companionable silence, the work moving through her hands without requiring thought. An older man sitting outside with a brother or cousin, speaking in the low, unhurried voices of people who have known each other their whole lives. The village was a web of relationships, marriages, blood ties, long rivalries, old debts, lasting friendships. And the evening was one of the few times those relationships could be tended to without the pressure of the day's labour interrupting everything. In more densely settled towns, the texture of evening would have been somewhat different. More noise, perhaps, from neighbouring households stacked close or above one another. More strangers. The sounds of a street settling, dogs finding their spots, a late vendor calling out, a child being called in by name. There was still community, but it had a different quality, more anonymous in its edges, more varied in its composition. Class and gender shaped what the evening looked like in ways that mattered. Women in ordinary households spent much of their evening in continued domestic work, spinning fibre, tending the children, managing what remained of the household's daily needs. This was not resentment necessarily, because the same was true of their mothers and their grandmothers, and the rhythm of it was simply part of what womanhood meant in their world. But it is worth holding clearly that rest, for women, was more conditional than for men, more easily interrupted, more likely to arrive later and end sooner. A man who had spent the day at heavy labour might sit with his beer and his neighbours and feel, with some legitimacy, that the day had released him. a woman with small children and a household to maintain was never quite so completely released. For the privileged, the officials, the priests, the wealthy landowners, the evening could be a genuinely social occasion. Guests were received, conversation was conducted with more formality and more ceremony, and the pleasures of a comfortable life were available in ways they simply were not for the labouring majority. But even in the finest homes, the evening had a natural limit. The night was dark, the oil for the lamps was not unlimited, and the body's need for sleep did not make exceptions for wealth. For everyone, regardless of station, tiredness was the evening's constant companion. A day of physical labour in the Egyptian sun is not a small thing, and by the time the meal was done and the lamp was burning low, the body had been asking for rest for hours. Conversation grew quieter. Children drifted towards sleep. The warmth of other people nearby became less a source of energy and more a comfort, something to settle into. The hum of the evening softened. The talk became slower, more spacious, the kind of talk that does not need to go anywhere in particular. And gradually, with no sharp boundary marking the transition, the quiet of the night gathered itself in around the household, and the long Egyptian dark prepared to do what it had always done. But not every body in Egypt was permitted to follow that slow drift toward rest. For some people, the gathering dark was not the end of the working day. It was simply the continuation of it, with less light to work by, and no particular promise of when the work would stop. Egypt was a civilization built on the labour of ordinary people, and that labour did not always respect the boundary that the sun drew at the end of each afternoon. The night had its own workers, its own demands, its own rhythms that ran parallel to the quieter life of the household and the village, pressing on through the hours that most people gave to sleep. The bakeries were among the most persistent. Bread was the foundation of Egyptian life. Not a luxury, not a supplement, but the central food of every household and every institution. Temples needed it, armies required it, workers were paid partly in it, and the scale at which it had to be produced was considerable. Baking bread meant grinding grain, and grinding grain was one of the most exhausting forms of labour that existed in the ancient world. Women knelt over flat grinding stones, pushing heavy upper stones forward and back in a motion that worked the shoulders, the back and the arms continuously. The flour this produced was coarse and full of grit, fine sand from the stone itself, which is why so many Egyptian skeletal remains show significant wear on the teeth. Grinding enough grain for the next day's bread often meant working into the night, especially in households where the bread supply had to be generous, or in the large institutional bakeries attached to temples and estates, where the quantities involved were truly substantial. You can almost hear it if you listen. The low rhythmic scraping of stone against stone, somewhere behind a wall, in the hour when the rest of the neighbourhood had gone quiet, steady, patient, unavoidable. The women who did this work were not exceptional in any way that their society would have marked. They were simply doing what had to be done in the time that was available to do it. Brewing was closely tied to baking, since Egyptian beer was made from fermented bread, and the two processes often occupied the same workers and the same spaces. Beer was not a luxury in Egypt. It was nutrition, currency, and comfort all at once. Workers on major building projects received daily rations of it. The production that fed those rations was constant and demanding, and the fermentation process had its own schedule that did not conform to human preferences about when the day should end. Someone had to tend to it. Someone had to monitor the warmth of the fermentation vessels, to judge the readiness of the mash, to manage a process that moved at its own pace regardless of whether the sun was up or not. Beyond food production, the textile work that filled so many Egyptian households was another form of labour that extended naturally into the evening hours. Spinning fibre, flax into linen thread, was something women did almost continuously, in the way that a later era might describe someone knitting, always with something in the hands during any available moment. The spindle did not require daylight in the same urgent way that other work did. It could be done by the faint glow of an oil lamp, by firelight, by the residual warmth and dim illumination of a dying evening fire. The fingers learned the motion so completely that they did not need to see it. Thread accumulated slowly, yard by yard, hour by hour, built from the repetition of a gesture so familiar it had become involuntary. But working in low light took something from the body. The eyes tired more quickly. The hands made errors they would not make in full daylight. A dropped spindle, a broken thread, a miscounted weave that had to be undone. Detailed work, the kind that required precision and close attention, was genuinely difficult after dark. Lamps in ordinary households were simple clay dishes holding a wick submerged in oil, and the circle of usable light they cast was small, enough to illuminate a pair of hands and the work between them, but not much more. Working within that circle for hours produced a particular kind of exhaustion that went beyond the muscles, a strain behind the eyes, and a dullness in the mind that came from the sustained effort of seeing in insufficient light. Seasonal demands complicated everything. During the inundation, when the Nile flooded its banks, and much agricultural work was temporarily impossible, Egypt redirected its labour toward major construction and civic projects. But in the harvest season, the pressure moved in the opposite direction with considerable force. The window in which grain could be cut and gathered before it was damaged or lost was not indefinitely wide, and when the harvest was ready, it had to be brought in. Extra hours were not optional. Workers who might otherwise have stopped at dusk kept moving through the early evening, driven by the knowledge that a season's food supply depended on speed. The body's complaints about fatigue were real, but had to be set aside. The harvest did not wait for rest. Guards and watchmen occupied a specific kind of nighttime labour, one that was not physically exhausting in the same grinding way as baking or harvesting, but that carried its own particular burdens. Granaries had to be watched. Temples had to be protected. Wealthy estates required someone attentive through the hours when ordinary people slept, and the temptation to take what was not yours became most acute. A watchman's night was long, mostly uneventful, punctuated by rounds and small routines meant to keep sleep from claiming them. The loneliness of it, the particular quality of sitting awake in the dark while everything around you rested, was its own form of difficulty. Those who moved goods along the Nile were also bound to schedules that had little to do with daylight. The river itself did not stop flowing at sunset, and the boats that carried grain, stone, livestock, timber, and trade goods were sometimes worked through the night when conditions favoured it, when the wind was favourable, when a delivery had to be made, when the timing of the flood made a particular window brief and precious. The men who crewed these vessels slept when they could, on the deck between tasks in the irregular patterns of people whose rest is always conditional. There is something worth sitting with here. The recognition that the picture of ancient Egyptian life does not consist only of people sleeping peacefully through a long quiet night. For many, perhaps for most, there was work somewhere in those dark hours. Not always all of it, not always the hardest kind, but something that had to be finished, something that could not wait, something that the darkness only made harder. The night was not cruel in any deliberate way. It was simply indifferent to human needs, as nights have always been. What linked all of these workers together, across their different tasks and different circumstances, was the fundamental reality of survival in a world without margins. Egypt's wealth was real, its grain stores, its trade, its monuments. But that wealth was built from the daily effort of people who could not afford to leave things undone. The lamp burned low, the hands kept moving, and the night, deep and quiet for some, continued to be measured in labour for others, and beyond those walls where the lamp still burned and the hand still moved, the streets themselves had become something else entirely. Once darkness settled fully over an Egyptian settlement, whether a modest riverside village or a sprawling administrative town near a temple complex, the character of the outdoor world changed in ways that were immediate and felt. The lanes and courtyards that had been full of motion, noise and commerce through the long afternoon grew still in a way that was not simply quiet. It was a different kind of space. The familiar geometry of mud-brick walls and narrow passages, which daylight made readable and navigable, became something closer to a maze in the dark. Shadows erased the small landmarks that guided a person from one turning to the next. The river, which had glittered and caught the eye all day, was now only a sound, a low moving presence heard but not seen from the paths that ran along its banks. If you had reason to be outside in those hours, you would have felt it almost immediately. The confidence with which you moved through the day would have contracted. Your steps would have shortened. You would have reached for walls, followed sounds, moved more carefully through space that no longer offered the easy legibility of daylight. The practical dangers of Egyptian streets after dark were not dramatic, but they were real, and they were the kind that accumulated quietly into genuine vulnerability. The ground itself was a hazard. Egyptian lanes were not paved in the way that later civilizations would come to expect. They were packed earth, occasionally worn smooth, often uneven, crossed by shallow drainage channels and interrupted by the small raised thresholds of doorways designed to keep floodwater out of homes. In daylight, these were features that the eye registered and the body navigated without particular thought. In darkness, they became the kind of obstacles that turned ankles, caught toes, and sent people sprawling in ways that were not merely embarrassing, but genuinely injurious. A broken bone in a world without organised medicine was a serious matter. A bad fall near a riverbank could be something worse. Theft existed in ancient Egypt with much the same quiet persistence it has held in every human society. The Egyptian legal record preserves cases of robbery, of grain stolen from stores, of tools and clothing taken from those who had little enough to begin with. Darkness was the hour that favoured this kind of activity, not because Egyptian criminals were particularly sophisticated, but for the simple and obvious reason that night reduced the chance of being seen and recognised. Those who had stores of value, grain, tools, finished cloth, small amounts of metal, understood that night increased their exposure in a way that required at least passive attention. A door secured with a wooden peg or a simple latch was not a strong barrier, but it was a barrier, and the small domestic security measures that ordinary households relied on existed precisely because the nighttime world had different rules than the daytime one. Animals added another layer of uncertainty. Dogs were common in and around Egyptian settlements, not pampered in the later Roman sense, but present as semi-domesticated scavengers and occasional guards. A pack of them encountered in a dark lane was unlikely to be welcoming to a stranger passing through unfamiliar territory. Scorpions and snakes, which occupied the edges of settlements where the desert met the cultivated land, moved more actively in the cooler night air. Egypt's natural world was not especially hostile by the standards of the ancient world, but it was not harmless either, and darkness removed the visual awareness that kept most encounters with it incidental rather than dangerous. Getting lost was perhaps the most underestimated risk, particularly in larger settlements. The towns that grew up around major temples or administrative centres were not laid out with the kind of rational grid planning that makes navigation intuitive. They accumulated over generations, built and rebuilt along the paths people had always walked, shaped by the river's edge, by old field boundaries, by the footprints of earlier structures. Someone unfamiliar with the neighbourhood, who found themselves outside after dark and disoriented, could wander for a considerable time before finding their bearings. For travellers arriving by river at night, or for those who lived at the margins of a large settlement and had to cross unfamiliar ground to reach home, this was a genuine concern rather than a theoretical one. How communities responded to these conditions was practical and largely informal. The wealthy household with its enclosed courtyard and a watchman who'd been discussed in the previous hour represented one end of the security spectrum. But most ordinary homes relied on simpler measures: doors that fastened from within, dogs that barked at unfamiliar sounds, the mutual awareness that came from living in close proximity to people who knew each other's routines. In a small village where everyone recognized everyone else, the social fabric itself offered a degree of protection. A stranger moving through after dark would be noticed, or at least noticed more readily than in the anonymity of a larger town. Work sites attached to major construction projects, the quarries, the building yards, the encampments that supported large-scale building activity, had more organized arrangements. Granaries holding the grain that paid workers' wages were too valuable to leave unwatched, and the same was true of tool stores and material stockpiles. The watchmen who walked these perimeters through the night represented something like an official security presence, though their effectiveness, as with all such arrangements, probably varied considerably depending on the individual and the hour. The contrast between a small agricultural village and a settlement clustered near a major temple or palace district was noticeable even after dark. In the village, silence came early and held. The rhythms of agricultural life demanded early rising, and the community largely retired when the light did. But in the districts surrounding large religious and administrative complexes, the night had a different texture. Temple personnel moved through enclosure walls on schedules dictated by ritual rather than rest. Delivery carts might arrive with supplies. The low sound of chanting or the smell of incense drifting beyond temple walls would have marked those spaces as ones where activity continued, where the dark was not total, where the ordinary logic of the sleeping village did not entirely apply. These places were not exactly busy, but they were not dead either, and the difference was felt by anyone who passed near them. What is worth holding on to through all of this is a sense of proportion. Egyptian nights were not characterized by widespread violence or constant fear. Most people in most settlements moved through the dark hours in a state of quiet watchfulness rather than acute danger, closing their doors, staying inside, letting the night pass as it did. But the vulnerability was real in the modest, persistent way that vulnerability tends to be when light is limited and the world outside has stopped offering its usual reassurances. The streets did not become threatening in any dramatic sense. They simply became less safe than they were in the day, in the understated way that all places become when the conditions that make them familiar are removed. And so the settlement breathed in the dark, still but not entirely silent, watched but not entirely secure, familiar in outline but changed in substance. The walls held, the doors were shut. The few lights that burned in windows or on temple grounds cast their small, quiet signals into the surrounding dark, marking the places where the night had not yet fully claimed the world. Those lights that burned beyond the ordinary household, the ones you might glimpse from the lane, the ones whose glow seemed to come from somewhere behind high walls and carved stone, belonged to a world that most Egyptians knew existed but would never enter. The temple was not a church, not a gathering place, not a building that the community moved through on its way to collective worship. It was something closer to a palace for the divine, a residence, a household in the most literal sense, inhabited by the presence of a god and tended by those whose entire lives were organized around that presence. The outer courts might receive the public on certain festival days, when processions carried sacred images out through the great pylon gates and ordinary people could glimpse something of what lay within. but the inner spaces, the columned halls that deepened toward the sanctuary, the small stone chamber at the very heart of the complex where the sacred image was kept, those belonged to the priests alone, and the priests, as night settled over the temple enclosure, did not simply close the doors and go home. If you'd been walking near a major temple at this hour, near Karnak, say, or one of the older cult centres along the Nile, the first thing you would have noticed is that it did not feel abandoned. The air around those enclosure walls carried something. Incense had been burning through the day, and while the heavy, sweet drift of it changed in quality after the main daytime rituals concluded, it did not disappear entirely. It settled into the stone, rose again slowly in the cooler night air, and clung to the clothes and hair of the priests who moved within. If the wind was right, traces of it reached the lanes outside. That particular Egyptian blend of kefi, or the simpler resins burned at lesser shrines. A smell that the body came to associate with something beyond the ordinary, even for people who encountered it only rarely. Lamplight burned inside. Not abundantly. The deep interior chambers of an Egyptian temple were not designed for widespread illumination, but steadily, in the focused way that ritual requires. Priests moving through corridors carried small flames. Lamps were placed before the sanctuary, before the shrines of subsidiary deities, in the storage rooms where sacred objects were kept and maintained. The effect inside those halls, if you could have seen it, which you almost certainly could not, would have been unlike anything in the domestic world. The painted ceilings and carved walls caught the light and held it differently than plain mud brick. The scale of the columns, their shadows rising into darkness overhead, the narrow passage between them lit only by a lamp carried at waist height. It would have been a world made almost entirely of warm light against deep stone shadow. An atmosphere so controlled and so removed from the randomness of outdoor dark that it felt like a different quality of night altogether. The night brought with it specific obligations. The great god had a body, or rather the sacred image kept within the sanctuary was understood as inhabited by divine presence, and like any body it required care. The rituals of feeding, of dressing, of applying oil and unguent to the image, of presenting offerings of food and drink, did not simply cease when the sun went down. They shifted, reduced in scale for the nighttime hours, but continued in attenuated form because the divine presence did not sleep in the way that humans did, and the maintenance of cosmic order required continuous attendance. Priests who served on the night rotation moved through these duties with the focused quiet that all nighttime work tends to take on, no less carefully than the day shifts, but differently, in the knowledge that the world outside was still, and that what happened in these hours was both intimate and necessary. The stores and treasuries within the temple enclosure were another part of what kept night activity purposeful. Temples were economic institutions as much as religious ones, holding grain, oil, linen, precious objects, and the accumulated donations of generations of worshippers and rulers. These spaces were guarded. A watchman walking the temple enclosure wall was doing something practical, as well as something sacred, protecting real goods of real value, not merely maintaining a symbolic vigil. The enclosure walls themselves, massive in the larger complexes, were designed partly for this purpose, separating the sacred world from the everyday world in a boundary that was physical as well as conceptual. For ordinary Egyptians, the temple at night existed largely as presence rather than experience. You understood that things were happening inside. You had perhaps participated in the public dimension of religious life, the festival processions, the oracle consultations held in accessible courtyards, the moments when the divine world briefly extended its edge into the public square. You would have known, in a general way, that priests performed rituals through the night, that the god was tended in darkness as in light, that the work of maintaining divine favour was not a thing that paused, but the specific content of those rituals, the particular prayers spoken, a careful choreography of approach and withdrawal within the sanctuary that remained beyond your knowledge and was meant to. This was not a system designed to be mysterious to ordinary people in any manipulative sense. It was simply that the temple functioned on a different register than the public world, and the nighttime hours made that difference most acute. The public religion of festivals and visible processions existed alongside a restricted priestly practice that was professional, trained, and carefully bounded. The two were not in conflict. They served different purposes, reached different aspects of the divine, addressed different needs. But at night, when the festival crowds were gone and the streets were quiet, only one of these two dimensions remained active. The deeper reason for all of this lay in what the Egyptians understood to be at stake. Night was not merely an inconvenient absence of light. It was the period during which the sun god travelled through the underworld, a genuine journey through darkness and danger, attended by threats that had to be repelled by ritual recitation, by the power of correct words spoken in the right order, by people qualified to speak them. The priests who chanted in the temple at night were not performing empty ceremony. They were, in the framework of everything they believed, actively participating in the maintenance of cosmic order. The sun had to travel safely through those hours to rise again. The enemies of light and order had to be named and repelled. The temple, in this view, was not merely a building, but a node in the structure of the world, a place where human action intersected with divine process, and where the night's most significant work was spiritual rather than physical. What this meant in practice, for the world outside the enclosure walls, was a kind of reassurance that did not require direct participation. The ordinary Egyptian sleeping behind a closed door, or moving quietly through a dark lane with a lamp held low, lived inside a world that was, in the most literal sense they would have understood, being watched over. Not by human authority, though that existed too, but by the ongoing effort of the divine household, the lamp still burning, the incense still rising, the words still being spoken, the god still being tended through the dangerous hours. The night was real, and it was uncertain, and it held its modest dangers. But it was also held within something larger, something continuous, something that did not sleep even when the rest of the world did. And in that knowledge, if not exactly in comfort, the settlements of ancient Egypt rested through the dark, knowing at some fundamental level that the long work of keeping the world whole continued even when no one could see it. And if you stepped away from those enclosure walls, away from the lamplight that glowed in temple corridors and the faint trace of incense carried on the night air, and simply stood still in an open place, on the roof of a house, or in a field beyond the settlement's edge, or on the bank of the Nile where the water lay quiet, you would have encountered the other great presence of the Egyptian night, the sky. It is difficult now, in a world of electric light and obscured horizons, to fully recover what the night sky meant to people who had nothing between themselves and the full darkness of the cosmos. In ancient Egypt, on a clear night away from the small oil lamps of the village, the stars did not merely appear. They arrived in force, a density of light overhead that modern eyes rarely witness, the Milky Way spreading in a broad arc from horizon to horizon, familiar constellations rotating in their steady paths, planets moving slowly against the fixed background of the stars. You would have known these things, not abstractly, not as knowledge held at a distance, but with the familiarity of someone who had grown up looking at the same sky every clear night of their life, who had watched it shift across seasons and years, who understood its rhythms the way you understood the rhythm of the flooding and the growing and the harvest. The Egyptians were careful observers of the sky, and they had been for a very long time. The rising of particular stars at particular moments in the year formed the backbone of their calendar, a system built not from arbitrary divisions but from the observed behaviour of the heavens as they intersected with the live cycle of the land. The star the Greeks would later call Sirius, the Egyptians called her Sopdet, rose just before dawn at a specific time each year, and that rising announced the approach of the inundation, the annual flood that would carry its dark silt across the fields and begin the whole agricultural year again. That single celestial event was not a poetic symbol. It was information. It told you that the river was coming. It told you that renewal was near. And because it was so useful, it became sacred, woven into the deepest fabric of how Egyptians understood the relationship between the sky above and the earth below. Timekeeping through the night was itself a skilled practice. In the temples, trained priests tracked the rising of specific stars, called decans, using careful observation that allowed them to mark the hours of darkness with reasonable precision. A star that appeared at a certain position above the horizon meant that a certain hour had passed. A different star rising meant another hour turning. This was not a casual thing. Getting the timing right had practical consequences for the rituals that had to be performed at specific moments, and it connected the human world of scheduled activity to the mechanical order of the cosmos in a way that felt, to the people doing it, absolutely natural. The stars were a clock. They were also a map of something larger than the earth. For learned priests and scribes, the sky was dense with meaning. The northern stars that never set, the ones that circled the celestial pole in endless rotation without ever sinking below the horizon, were called the indestructibles, and they represented a form of eternity directly visible overhead. The soul of a deceased pharaoh might ascend to join them, and the texts that covered the walls of royal burial chambers describe this journey in careful detail. But the night sky was not only a royal inheritance. Ordinary people looked up at the same stars. They may not have known the precise theology, the exact textual traditions, the specific names and attributes assigned by learned ritual specialists. But they knew the sky was there, that it was vast, that it moved in patterns that exceeded a single human life in their scope, and that the presence of the stars overhead on a clear night carried a weight that was not merely physical. Darkness, in the Egyptian framework, was never simply neutral. It held the sun during the hours of his absence from the living world, cradling that essential force through the dangerous territory of the underworld, the duat, where the divine bark moved through chambers of shadow and threat before emerging renewed at dawn. The night was, in this sense, both threatening and necessary. Without the passage through darkness there could be no sunrise. Without the sun's willingness to enter the underworld and travel its full length, the world would fail. This meant that darkness was not the enemy of life, even though it was the condition of death. It was the passage through which renewal became possible. For ordinary people resting after dark, this understanding worked in ways that did not require theological study to feel. You knew that the night was the time of greatest uncertainty, the hours when illness could worsen, when animals moved in the fields, when the edge of the known world felt closer than it did in daylight. But you also knew that the sky overhead was not chaotic. The stars followed their courses. Sopdet would rise again. The sun that had vanished below the western horizon would complete its journey and return. The order of the cosmos was not in doubt, even in the dark. It was simply invisible for a time, being renewed in a place you could not see. There is something quietly extraordinary about standing in the dark under a sky like that, and the Egyptians knew it. Even people who never entered a temple library, who never studied the star charts or learned the names of the decans, would have felt the scale of the night sky as something that exceeded ordinary life. It had the quality that sacred things tend to have, the sense of something present and enormous that demands attention without demanding explanation. You could lie on a roof in the warm Egyptian night, the stones still holding the day's heat beneath you, the air cool above, and watch the great wheel of stars turning overhead, and feel yourself held within something much larger than the village, the field, the river, the horizon. That feeling of being small within something orderly and ancient and continuous was not a private experience that Egyptians had to go looking for. It came every clear night, unprompted, simply by being alive in a world without artificial light, under a sky that had not changed in any way that mattered since their great-grandparents' great-grandparents had watched it from the same ground. The priests named and catalogued the stars, the astronomers tracked their movements with disciplined attention, the scribes recorded what they saw. But the experience of the sky itself belonged to everyone. The farmer resting between the irrigation channels, the child too warm to sleep indoors, the watchman standing quietly at the edge of a courtyard, the woman sitting outside her door in the last of the evening warmth. The stars were there, indifferent and magnificent, turning through their long, slow courses above the sleeping earth. And in that turning, something about the night became less uncertain, less frightening, held as the land itself was held, within a pattern too large and too old to fail. And eventually, beneath that vast and turning sky, the body made its claim. However grand the cosmos, however layered with meaning the darkness overhead, at some point the exhaustion of the day settled into the bones, the eyes grew heavy, and even the most devoted watcher of stars had to lie down. Sleep in ancient Egypt was not a retreat into luxury. It was the body insisting on what it needed, in whatever space and on whatever surface was available. For most Egyptians, that surface was simple. Woven reed mats spread across a mudbrick floor were the most common sleeping arrangement, practical, easy to roll up during the day, and offering a modest barrier between the body and the ground. If you were fortunate, the mat might be thick, tightly woven, soft enough to ease the pressure of a hip or a shoulder against the hard earth beneath. If you were not, it was thin, and you felt the floor through it with every shift of your body through the night. Those with more means slept on wooden beds, low frames of wood, sometimes with a slight incline, strung across with linen webbing or leather strips that flexed under the sleeper's weight. These were real possessions, listed in household inventories and passed down through families. But even on a proper bed, the head didn't rest on a soft pillow as we know it now. Instead, it rested on a headrest, a curved wooden support, sometimes beautifully carved, that lifted the neck just clear of the surface beneath. To our eyes, it looks deeply uncomfortable, but Egyptians used them throughout their lives, and their bodies would have adapted to that particular posture from childhood. The headrest also served a more practical function. It kept the head lifted away from the mat or surface below, allowing air to circulate slightly, and offering a small defence against insects that might move along the floor in the dark. Because insects were a constant presence. The warm Egyptian nights brought flies that had not quite settled, mosquitoes rising from irrigation channels and the margins of the river, small biting things that found exposed skin with a persistence that no darkness could stop. The wealthy had recourse to linen hangings that could be draped to create a loose barrier around the sleeping body. The poor dealt with bites as a simple fact of rest, the way they dealt with most discomforts, by enduring them. Smoke helped sometimes, and fires or smouldering materials might be kept burning nearby to discourage the worst of it. But there was no full solution. Sleep in the Egyptian night meant occasional waking, the slap of a hand against an arm or a neck, the brief return to consciousness before the body pulled you back under. Heat was perhaps the greater challenge through much of the year. The mud-brick walls that had absorbed the fierce afternoon sun released their warmth slowly through the night hours, meaning that the interior of a house could remain stuffy and close well past midnight. This is why rooftops became a natural sleeping space for so much of the year. Families carried their mats up after dark, spreading them on the flat mud-brick surfaces above their rooms, where the air moved more freely and the temperature dropped with the open sky above. Children slept beside parents, grandparents settled in their accustomed places, siblings arranged themselves close together in the way of people who had always shared space without question. There was nothing unusual about this. Privacy and sleep, the idea of an individual room and an individual bed belonging to one person, was a concept that applied only to the highest ranks of society, and even then only partially. For everyone else, sleep was a communal experience, conducted in close proximity to the breathing and shifting of others. Clothing worn to sleep was likely whatever had been worn through the day, simple linen garments that served equally as day-wear and night-wear for those without the resources for a separate set of clothes. Linen, fortunately, was well suited to the climate. It breathed, it absorbed, it cooled the skin in moving air, and it could be washed relatively easily. The body beneath it was clean in the Egyptian fashion. Egyptians were notably attentive to bodily hygiene by the standards of the ancient world, washing regularly, using natron for cleansing, oiling the skin against the drying effects of heat and dust. But no amount of care changed the fundamental reality of a warm night after a day of physical labour. You settled onto your mat or your bed carrying the honest tiredness of a body that had worked since dawn. And that tiredness ran deep. For agricultural labourers, craftsmen, water carriers, women managing the grinding of grain and the preparation of food and the management of children, and the 100 other tasks that filled the hours of daylight. The fatigue at the end of the day was not mild, it was comprehensive. The body had been used fully, and it knew it. Sleep for these people likely came quickly, dropping into the deep unconscious rest of the genuinely exhausted, the kind of sleep that makes the surrounding world irrelevant. Whether that sleep lasted uninterrupted through the night is another question. The patterns we recognize as normal now, a single, long block of sleep from dark until dawn, may not have been as universal as we assume. There is evidence from various pre-industrial societies that sleep in conditions of natural darkness often divided itself into two distinct periods, with a quieter interval of wakefulness between them. In that middle-of-the-night interval, a person might tend a fire, feed an infant, step outside briefly, or simply lie in the dark in a state of drowsy calm before the second period of sleep drew them back. If Egyptians experienced something similar, that quiet interval in the deep hours would have been its own particular kind of consciousness, soft and unhurried, before the first light of earliest morning began to find the edges of the horizon. Because they did wake early. The rhythms of the agricultural world and the temple world both demanded it. The coolest hours near dawn were precious working hours. Animals needed tending. Bread needed baking before the day grew too hot for the fires. The body that had gone down with the darkness began to surface again in those first grey moments before the sun returned. There was no lingering. There was no gradual negotiation with the morning. You were up, and the day began. In between, in those hours of actual rest, the sleeping body occupied its small space with a kind of quiet dignity. The child curled at the edge of the mat, the labourer on his back, arms loose, chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep sleep. The old woman on her side, her headrest in place, her hands open. The night sounds continuing around them, a dog somewhere in the village, the Nile moving, the distant call of a water bird, the settling of the cooling walls. Whatever the dreams that came, whatever fears or protections moved through that sleeping mind, the body itself was simply resting, given over entirely to the dark and to the ancient uncomplicated mercy of sleep. But the sleeping mind was never entirely still. Even in that deep, comprehensive rest, the body surrendered, the hands open, the breath slow. Something continued moving through the Egyptian night. Thoughts without shape, images that arrived unbidden, the strange and vivid country that the mind entered when the body let go. Dreams were not, to the ancient Egyptian, simply the random noise of a resting brain. They were something that arrived from elsewhere, something that deserved attention. The Egyptians had a word, Araset-utamd, which meant dream, and carried within it a root connected to the idea of waking, of being roused, as if the dream itself was a kind of alert, a communication, something nudging you toward consciousness even as you slept. This was not a casual belief held loosely by a few. It ran through every level of Egyptian society, from the pharaoh receiving divine guidance in the night to the ordinary farmer waking with an uneasy image still pressing behind his eyes. Dream interpretation was a genuine and respected practice. There existed written guides, collections of dream scenarios with explanations of their meanings, compiled by scribes, consulted by those who could read them, or who had access to someone who could. If you dreamed of sailing in a boat, if you dreamed of your teeth falling away, if you dreamed of seeing your own face in a mirror, each of these carried a possible meaning, a suggested implication for what was coming in waking life. Not all meanings were dire, many were simply informational. A dream might signal good fortune in the fields, a resolution to a dispute, a safe journey. But others pointed toward illness, loss, or the attention of forces that were better avoided. Because the night in Egyptian understanding was also the time when the boundary between the living world and the unseen world grew thinner. The darkness that was simply the absence of the sun to practical eyes was, in its deeper layer, the passage of Ra through the underworld, the god moving through that vast and difficult terrain beneath the earth, beset by enemies, sustained by the prayers and rituals of those above. The night was not empty. It was full of movement and contest and forces that the waking eye could never observe directly, and some of those forces could reach through into the sleeping mind or hover near the sleeping body with intentions that were not always benign. Spirits of the dead, particularly those who had died in difficult circumstances, violently or without proper burial, were believed capable of troubling the living. They might appear in dreams with unsettling persistence. They might bring illness, confusion, or a kind of draining anxiety that left the sleeper worse at morning than at night. The Egyptians had a category of medical understanding that attributed certain ailments specifically to the influence of the dead, and the treatment required was not purely physical. It addressed the spiritual source directly. This is where protection came in, and where the line between religion and what we might call superstition became not so much a line as a continuous and seamless thread. Before sleep, many households would have attended to a range of small but significant practices. Amulets were among the most important. These were objects of carved stone, faience, or other materials shaped into particular forms. The Eye of Horus, the Jed pillar suggesting stability and endurance, the Tiet knot associated with Isis, figures of protective deities like Bes and Taweret. Bes in particular was a guardian of the household night, depicted as a stocky, lion-faced dwarf with his tongue protruding, an image deliberately vivid and meant to frighten away what might come. He appeared on the walls of birth chambers and domestic spaces, and his image was thought to stand between the sleeping person and whatever moved in the dark hours. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, served a similar protective function, especially over pregnant women and young children, presiding over the vulnerability of bodies in their most open moments. Amulets were worn on the body, kept near the sleeping mat, and incorporated into the physical space of the home. A household might have several, accumulated over years, each carrying its particular charge. Certain words could be spoken before sleep, short prayers, appeals to protective deities, verbal acknowledgements of forces that needed to be addressed aloud. These were not elaborate rituals requiring a priest. They were domestic, private, the kind of small observances that a mother performed as she settled her children for the night, or that an old man murmured to himself in the dark before his eyes closed. Children, in particular, occupied a place of recognized vulnerability in the Egyptian night. Infant mortality was a reality that no family was insulated from, and the darkness seemed to hold its particular share of risk. A child who was ill, a child who slept fitfully, a child who woke crying in the night. These things were attended to not only with physical care but with spiritual attention. Spells intended to protect children from night demons, from the approach of harmful spirits, from the breath of illness that seemed to move more freely in the dark hours, appear in medical and magical texts from various periods. These were not seen as separate categories of knowledge. The physical and the spiritual addressed the same problem from complementary angles, and an attentive parent drew on both without contradiction. There was a particular figure in Egyptian belief sometimes called the Mut, a dead spirit, often of a woman who had died in childbirth, associated with potential harm to infants in the night. Protective spells named such forces directly and commanded them to withdraw, to turn away, to find no entry. The act of naming the danger was itself part of the defense. You didn't wait quietly for harm. You addressed it. You surrounded the sleeping child with objects and words and the accumulated intention of people who loved them and understood the world to be layered in ways that required active attention. Adult fears in the night were somewhat more diffuse but no less real. An unusual sound, a sense of something not quite right in the familiar space of the room. A dream that left the waking mind unsettled in ways that were difficult to explain. The Egyptian response to these experiences was not to dismiss them, but to take them seriously and to act accordingly. You might consult someone with knowledge, a person skilled in interpreting dreams, or in identifying which spirit might be responsible for a disturbance. You might acquire a new amulet, recite a particular prayer, burn something fragrant to drive away what lingered. There were professional practitioners, sometimes called Sao, protective magicians in a sense, who could be sought out for more persistent problems. Their work was not regarded as fringe or unusual. It was a practical service addressing a practical need. What emerges from all of this, looked at quietly and with some patience, is not a picture of a people living in constant fear of the dark. Most nights were ordinary, most sleepers slept, and the protective practices around them were as routine and unremarkable as locking a door is today, a small gesture of reasonable precaution before the hours of rest. The world was understood to contain forces that required acknowledgement. The appropriate response was not anxiety, but preparation. You placed the amulet in its position. You spoke what needed to be spoken. You arranged the bodies of your children close to your own, within reach, within hearing, and then you lay down in the dark, surrounded by everything that could be done, and you let sleep come. The night, for all its mystery and all its unseen movement, was also simply the time when people rested, and in most homes, through most of the long hours between sundown and dawn, that is what happened, quietly, gratefully, in the ordinary, irreplaceable darkness of a world that had not yet invented any other way. Not everyone who lay down in that darkness rested equally. The amulets, the prayers, the careful domestic arrangements, these were shared across much of Egyptian society in one form or another. The belief in protection did not belong only to the wealthy, but the quality of the night itself, the physical texture of those hours between sundown and dawn varied enormously depending on where you sat in the long, layered hierarchy of Egyptian life. The darkness that fell over the estate of a provincial official was not the same darkness that settled over the crowded housing blocks where labourers slept pressed against one another, damp with heat, waiting for a tomorrow that would ask more of them than the day before had given back. Begin with the labourer. Begin with the man or woman who had worked the fields through the full weight of an Egyptian day, who had bent and lifted and carried under a sun that offered nothing gentle, whose hands by evening were cracked and stiff, and whose back ached in the specific grinding way that comes not from injury, but from the simple repetition of hard physical work performed across years. When that person came home, they came home to a space that was small. The homes of ordinary Egyptians were modest structures, mudbrick, low-ceilinged, a few rooms at most, often shared between a family and sometimes extended family as well. There was no cool stone floor reserved for sleeping. There were mats, and the mat went on a floor that retained the heat of the day long into the night. In summer, the air inside a closed Egyptian home did not cool significantly after sunset. It sat thick and close, heavy with the presence of bodies, carrying the smell of the evening meal, of work-worn clothing, of the animals that sometimes shared the outer space of a domestic compound. You could sleep on the roof in warmer months, and many did. That was a small relief. The roof offered the night air, the possibility of a breeze, something approaching coolness in the hours before dawn. But the roof was open, and the insects that gathered in the dark over the river valley were not discouraged by elevation. Gnats and mosquitoes were a persistent feature of Egyptian nights that no amount of social standing made entirely avoidable. Even so, for those who had access to nothing better, the roof was preferable to the still air below, and families arranged themselves on mats under the open sky and made the best of it. Food, by the evening of a hard day, was whatever had been prepared or remained. For most ordinary households this meant bread, perhaps some onions or vegetables, maybe dried fish or a portion of something that had been cooked earlier. The diet was not without nutrition. Egyptian workers were fed and understood to need feeding in order to function. But the evening meal in a labourer's home was plain, repetitive, and arrived after work was done rather than as a comfortable ritual of rest and pleasure. You ate because the body required it. Then you lay down because the body required that too, and you slept as deeply as exhaustion could carry you, which was usually very deep indeed. Servants in elite households occupied an in-between position that was, in some ways, more complicated. They might sleep within or directly adjacent to the homes they served, which meant better construction, more stable walls, sometimes a bit more space. But they were also at the disposal of the household in ways that disturbed whatever rest they managed. A child crying in the night, a need that arose in the early hours, a mistress who slept badly and required attendance. These things fell to the servants to address. Their nights were interrupted in ways that the labourers were not, because their labour did not end with a walk home. It followed them into the sleeping hours and could reclaim them at any moment. Now move upward through the household levels, and the night begins to change in tangible ways. An official of reasonable standing, a scribe in a government position, a craftsman of high skill working on royal monuments, these individuals came home to something more. More rooms, more space per person, walls that had perhaps been whitewashed or decorated, sleeping platforms raised off the floor that helped with both comfort and the minor but real benefit of being slightly further from the insects that moved at ground level. There might be a headrest of carved wood, functional rather than soft, designed to keep the head elevated and allow air to circulate, and a linen sheet of reasonable quality. The evening meal would have included more variety, more protein, perhaps wine where a labourer drank beer of variable quality, and water that was not always trustworthy. Light was a marker of status in ways that are easy to underestimate. Oil lamps required oil, and oil had a cost. A household that could afford to burn lamps generously through the early evening, to sit in reasonable light and talk or eat or attend to some small task after dark, was a household with resources. The poor used light sparingly, if at all, and darkness arrived for them earlier, not at sunset, but when the last usable natural light faded from whatever small window or open doorway their home possessed. The elite household extended the evening with flame, with conversation, with the small luxury of visibility. At the upper reaches of Egyptian society, the night was a different world again. The homes of the wealthy were designed with the climate in mind, with thick walls that absorbed heat slowly, with interior courtyards that caught the night air, with gardens that offered shade and the cooling presence of water. A high official might sleep on a proper bed with linen of fine weave, with servants nearby but not crowding the room, with enough space that the air moved somewhat even in the worst of summer. Meals had been substantial, served with deliberate attention to what was offered and in what order. Wine of good quality. Food prepared by someone whose specific task was food preparation, rather than the general labour of keeping a household running. And yet, even in those comfortable rooms, with the linen cool and the lamp trimmed low and the household quiet, certain things did not yield to wealth. The heat of high summer pressed through even well-built walls. The insects that were simply a feature of the Nile environment found their way in regardless of the quality of the construction. Illness arrived without asking about social position. A child sickened in an elite home just as in a labourer's home, and the terror of that night was the same terror. Grief did not sort itself by household income, and the darkness that fell was the same darkness everywhere, the same absence of Ra, the same passage of the god through his difficult journey below the earth, the same long, quiet hours in which the world held its breath and waited. What wealth provided was softening. It did not provide exemption. The privileged slept better than the exhausted on average, in the sense that their bodies were less destroyed by the day's demands, their stomachs more reliably full, their spaces less crowded with other bodies competing for the same thin column of cool air. But they were all subject to the night. They all moved through those same hours with only what their world had given them, linen or mat, lamp or darkness, rest or the grinding wakefulness of a body that had been asked too much and could not yet let go. The gap between them was real. It shaped everything. But in the end, the night pressed down on all of them equally, patient and indifferent, until the first pale suggestion of morning began to gather at the edge of the eastern sky. Somewhere in those last deep hours, something shifted. Not yet light, not even close to light, but something in the quality of the darkness itself. The absolute stillness of the middle night began to loosen, almost imperceptibly, the way sleep loosens just before waking. The Nile Valley held its breath a little differently. The temperature, which had been static for hours, began its first faint decline toward the coolest point of the pre-dawn. And somewhere in a bakery, in a riverside dock, in the outer room of a household compound, a person opened their eyes before the sun had given them any reason to. The bakers were always first. Bread was the foundation of Egyptian life, the base of every meal from the poorest labourer's table to the offering placed before a god in the innermost sanctuary of a great temple. And bread required time. The dough had to be prepared, the ovens had to be heated to the right temperature, and all of it had to be ready before the day made its real demands. So the bakers rose while it was still profoundly dark, while the household behind them slept on, while the street outside was quiet in the particular way that only the hours just before dawn can be quiet. Not the silence of danger, not the silence of caution, but the silence of a world that has not yet remembered itself. You can imagine the small sounds of it, the scrape of a clay vessel being moved, the soft percussion of dough being worked against a flat surface, the first crackle of a fire being coaxed from coals that had been banked the night before, the smell of wood smoke and warming grain beginning to thread through the cool air. Bakers in ancient Egypt worked hard and worked early, and their work was unglamorous and essential in equal measure. Their hands white with flour, their arms strong from the kneading, their eyes adjusted to working by the low orange light of oil lamps in the time before the sun came to help them. Near the river the boatmen were stirring too. The Nile was a working waterway through every hour that permitted movement, and the hours just before dawn were favourable ones. Cooler, calmer, the surface of the water holding the last of the night sky in a long dark mirror before the light came and broke it into glare. Cargo boats preparing to move grain downriver, fishing vessels checking lines and nets set the evening before, the small craft that carried goods and people across the narrow channels between bank and island and sandbar. Their crews were waking, checking ropes, reading the water, exchanging the minimal talk of people who understood each other well enough to need few words in the early dark. In the villages and towns the stirring was gradual and domestic, a mother waking to attend to a child who had grown restless in the cooling air, an older woman who had always slept lightly rising to begin the first preparations of the morning, water to be fetched, bread from the baker's or what remained from the day before, the quiet reorganization of a household space so that it could shift from sleeping place to living place again. In the workers' villages near the great construction sites, the transition was less gentle. Overseers moved through the pre-dawn with purpose, and the men whose labour would continue the work of monuments not yet finished had to be on their feet and ready before the light arrived. The day was measured in available light, and none of it was to be wasted. All of this was the resumption of a rhythm so old and so deeply practised that it did not require thought. Egyptian life ran on cycles, and every morning was both a beginning and a return. The sun that would rise in the east was not merely a new day but a resurrection. Ra, emerging again from his night journey through the underworld, having passed through the trials of the dark hours, renewed and ready to cross the sky once more. The priests in the great temples understood this explicitly, and their pre-dawn rituals were timed to meet the god's return with ceremony and preparation. But ordinary Egyptians felt it too, in less formal ways. The darkness ending was not just convenient, it was restoration. It was the world proving itself still intact. The Nile underpinned all of it. The river was the reason this narrow strip of life existed at all in the middle of an unlivable desert, and its rhythms gave the year its shape. The flood, the planting, the harvest, and then the flood again. Even the smaller cycle of the day followed the river in some sense. The morning mist rising off the water, the cooling breeze that came in the late afternoon from the north, the slow silting quiet of night when the river's sounds, the lap and pull of moving water, the calls of birds along the reed beds, were the constant background against which all other Egyptian sounds were arranged. To wake before dawn in the Nile Valley was to wake into a world that had been shaped by that river for so long that every habit, every expectation, every tool and task and household arrangement bore its influence. For those whose night had been broken and difficult, the sick, the worried, the mother who had not truly slept, the worker whose body had kept him at the surface of rest without ever letting him sink, the pre-dawn hours brought a particular kind of resignation and relief together. The night was ending. Whatever it had asked of them, they had come through it. The demands of the coming day were real and already accumulating somewhere in the back of the mind, but for a few more minutes, in the cool grey that was gathering along the eastern horizon without yet becoming light, there was a pause, a threshold. The night releasing its hold before the day had quite taken it. Children in their sleeping mats sometimes shifted and settled deeper as the pre-dawn cool arrived, finding rest more easily in those final dark minutes than they had managed in the heat of the earlier night. Old people lay still and listened to the household coming slowly alive around them. Somewhere a rooster made its declaration, too early, as roosters always are, and then another answered from further away, and the sound of it moved outward across the sleeping village like a slow ripple crossing still water. The stars which had kept watch through all of it, through the meals and the prayers, the labours and the fears, the dreams and the long silences, were beginning to fade now, not gone yet, but thinning, their light outcompeted by something that had not yet crested the horizon but was clearly coming. The eastern sky held its colour close, a deepening of grey into the faintest suggestion of warmth. Another night in the ancient valley was drawing toward its close, and so it closes, this long unhurried passage through the dark hours of a world that ended thousands of years ago, and yet in so many of its quieter details never quite ended at all. What the night reveals about ancient Egypt is not the Egypt of monuments and pharaohs and golden masks. It is something smaller and more lasting than any of that. It is the Egypt of a woman trimming an oil lamp so her family can see their evening meal. A man sitting outside his doorway after supper, too warm to go in just yet, listening to the sounds of neighbours settling. Children tucked onto sleeping mats, resisting sleep the way children have always resisted sleep, until their bodies simply surrendered to it. An old woman lying still in the deep dark, listening to the breathing of the people she loved, counting them by sound the way she had counted them every night for decades. This is what the darkness held. Not mystery, not menace, though it held those things too, but mostly just the ordinary texture of human life continuing past the point where the sun gave it permission. Think of the homes you've moved through tonight, the low mud-brick walls still radiating the day's warmth as the air outside cooled, the smell of oil lamps, of cumin and coriander, of the river carried in on the evening breeze, the rough weave of a linen mat, the particular weight of a clay cup warming in both hands, the sound of a neighbourhood quieting, voices becoming murmurs, murmurs becoming silence, silence becoming the long-held breath of night. These were not exotic or distant sensations. They were the sensations of a life being lived, carefully within its means, with the small pleasures it could manage and the fears it could not entirely put down. The lamps burned low and then burned out. The stars crossed the sky in their slow, ancient procession, and the priests who understood them best watched with careful attention, knowing that the heavens were not decoration but information, time made visible, the gods made present, the order of the world confirmed again each night by the fact of their turning. Ordinary Egyptians looked up too, perhaps without the same formal knowledge, but with the same instinctive sense that the sky was speaking if you knew how to be still enough to hear it. Work that did not end at sunset continued somewhere in the city, bakers already stirring toward that pre-dawn beginning, night watchmen making their rounds, mothers sitting up with restless infants, scribes perhaps finishing by lamplight something the day had not given them enough hours to complete. Egypt did not entirely stop. It adjusted, it quieted, it reorganized itself around different needs and different rhythms, and even its rest was purposeful. Sleep as restoration, as the body doing what the daylight hours prevented, as the mind opening to the dreams that the gods might choose to send. And there is something in all of that which crosses the thousands of years between that world and this one, without any difficulty at all. The desire to eat something warm at the end of a long day, the comfort of familiar voices, the small ritual of preparing for sleep, the mat laid out, the lamp put down, the body finding its preferred arrangement, the mind beginning its slow unhooking from the worries of the waking hours, the particular relief of lying down when you're genuinely tired, the way a household sounds when everyone in it has finally found rest. These things have not changed. They cannot change, because they are not customs or fashions or beliefs that rise and fall with empires. They are what it means to be a person inside a body, inside a day that ends. The ancient Egyptians were very far from us in time, and in some ways very far in understanding. Their gods, their rituals, their explanations for the world were not ours. But in the dark, in the quiet, in the small animal comfort of warmth and rest and nearness to the people they trusted, they were doing exactly what you are doing right now, settling, breathing, letting the day go. The ancient valley is quiet now. The Nile moves in the dark the way it has always moved, patient and unhurried, and utterly indifferent to the centuries. The stars that the priests read so carefully are still there, still turning, still crossing the same sky above the same narrow ribbon of life that the river made possible. The homes are dust, but once they were warm. The lamps are gone, but once they gave light. The people who slept here, who worried and worked and loved and rested in this very dark, were real, and their nights were full, and they passed through them and rose again into their mornings, just as you will rise into yours. For now, though, let the quiet have you. If this journey into the ancient night was something you found worth taking, please consider leaving a like, and if you haven't yet, subscribing to History Drift. There are many more quiet corners of the ancient world waiting to be explored together. Sleep well.